Hey everyone, it's Debbie Potts, and I'm so excited to finally get Cynthia Thurlow on my show. I listened to her speak on intermittent fasting at our nutritional therapy conference back in February before the pandemic started, and we all started to have this crazy world we're in now. So, Cynthia, thanks for coming on the show on my podcast to share your amazing knowledge and mindset and passion and purpose with all of us.
Thanks for that nice introduction. I've been looking forward to this.
I know you're super busy trying to get out this information as I have been, and really trying to impact the world, trying to get everyone to be aware of health and what immune system does, and how nutritional therapy and fasting and all these different things that are pretty inexpensive or free that we could all do just to get this message out across to the world is just kind of my mission. Is we listen to everyone on social media, and like I was just reading something Mike Muscle posted. It's like, okay,
Mhm.
we're all talking to each other. How do we get this information to the people that don't know what
Mhm.
intermittent fasting is and don't know how the immune system works and eating real food? So
Mhm.
what have you found since February you've been out and about, and what have you kind of learned this year, and how you can get this message out to people how to be healthy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So we actually met in Portland, Oregon, earlier this year, and everything kind of shut down in Washington, D.C. In mid-March. My kids have literally been taking, all of their classes from the beauty of their bedrooms or the beauty of our house. And so I would say the biggest takeaway for me personally is that we're all stronger than we think we are.
Mhm.
That's number one. We're far stronger because it's only through adversity that we really know and understand and appreciate what we are capable of. I mean, it's not when things are easy. When things are easy, that's very different. I would say the number two big thing is that I believe intrinsically that the quality of our health or lack thereof, our metabolic flexibility is going to be the way out of this. And when
Mhm.
you look at statistics, here in the United States, most westernized countries, the degree of metabolic inflexibility, obesity, overweight status, hypertension, diabetes, et cetera, you really start to recognize that this pandemic is really shining a light on people, or should be, for how to take better care of yourself. Because the people generally who are doing best, if they can track COVID, are those that are metabolically flexible. So you're a healthy weight, you sleep, eat a nutrient dense diet, you get plenty of sunshine and exercise. And as you stated, it really is designed to be simple. We
Yeah.
aren't making things super complicated. And yet we've gotten so far away from an ancestral health perspective. And, my family, I have teenage boys and my husband and two crazy doodles. And, the joke is that my dogs have never been walked so much in their entire lives. In fact, I think the first couple weeks, they're like, what is with this 4 and 5 miles a day of walking when we couldn't go to the gym? And that's kind of perpetuated that they get these really long walks. And so I'm getting lots of vitamin D exposure being out in the sunlight. And for
Mhm.
the first time in a long time, my vitamin D levels are super therapeutic. So they're higher, way higher than they've ever been. And I
Mhm.
have to believe that a lot of that is the, cumulative impact of, light exposure on my skin. So
Mhm.
I think this year has taught us a lot. I think it's definitely brought us together even closer as a family, and certainly has made me value the kinds of content that I'm bringing in my business and to my predominantly female population of women that follow me,
Mhm.
just really trying to provide as much value as possible, really pivoting. I think every single person listening has had to pivot in their personal life and professional life. And I love to have the opportunity to travel and speak to larger groups of people. And I've been doing that from the beauty of my home studio as opposed to traveling and being in front of people. But yeah, I think it's definitely been a growthful year. I hope it is for everyone that's listening, to allow us an opportunity to grow, even though we may be doing things not the way we want to. I've gotten really tired of wearing masks, and the area that I live in the Washington, D.C. area is pretty strict.
Mhm.
And so the only way that you're getting into the grocery store or going to get a haircut or, running into Target, you got to wear a mask. And so I tell my kids, I'm like, got to wear the mask. That's just part of what we need to do. It's just one of many things we're doing that maybe are not our favorite things to do, but we're doing it for the greater good.
Yeah, so true. I mean, I moved from Seattle in June. We decided to put our house on the market in April, sold it in 5 days, and moved to North San Diego, and just in a beautiful area and just near the ocean, Solana Beach,
Hmm.
and near Rancho Santa Fe in the mountains, and just beauty. And I always thank COVID
Hmm.
for allowing us to be able to work remote and be able to
Hmm.
be anywhere that we're close to an airport so we can travel when we need to for work when that opens up. But
Yeah.
it is, what I keep working on myself and with my coaching clients is really focusing on the learning opportunities and
Hmm.
what we can get from each negative experience and make it a positive and what's a gift in this. And I keep going back to this book I wrote 5 years ago, The Holistic Method, these 8 lifestyle
Hmm.
elements that we can all do that don't cost anything,
Hmm.
eating real food and exercising the right amount and getting our sleep and managing our
Hmm.
stress and getting movement, like walking your dog three
Yeah.
times a day. And of course, digestion and gut health, hydration and happiness, gratitude,
Hmm.
journaling. And I think all these things is just what I've been talking about for 5, 10 years. And it's like, all right, here's when we really need to do that.
Yeah.
But one thing you talk about a lot, I've done a lot of research on, is in nutritional therapy with intermittent fasting.
Hmm.
How does chronic stress impact our ability to be healthy? We'll start with that and then kind of tie into fasting, how if that's good or bad.
That's a great question. Yeah, so we know, and I can tell you, I'm a nurse practitioner, that every single GI map, which is a DNA based stool test that I've run
Mhm.
this year or since COVID,
We just did a
uh,
podcast with them actually that
yeah,
just posted. So yes, it's amazing.
so every single woman I've done this lab test on has had H. pylori. Every single
Yeah.
one. In fact, I started seeing this pattern on the GI map that I hadn't seen before, and so I called up their doctors and said, this might be my N of 30, but, and they said, oh yeah, we're seeing the same pattern. And we agree with you. It's the impact of stress on the gut microbiome. And so to touch on your question, the things that I see in terms of immune system response and stress is that we see changes in the gut microbiome. And so you see opportunistic infections.
Mhm.
You will see, for people, maybe they have variations in their digestion. They may become more constipated because they're not relaxed. And we know that you have to be in the parasympathetic mindset to have a bowel movement, or things that might have sped up. So maybe they've got what looks like a little bit of irritable bowel syndrome. I see a lot of weight gain because people are stressed. And I don't think it's just that they're eating the wrong foods. I think we recognize that when cortisol is up, that's can be a fat storage hormone. We know that influences insulin. These are two big hormones that are not bad hormones, but when they're elevated, you are in fat storage mode. And so being able to mitigate, as you mentioned, mitigating stress reduction strategies are really critical. And then, it's also this mindset piece that, is so, so important, irrespective of, where you live in the country, or whether you're in the city or you're in the suburbs or in rural parts of the country, just the degree of the mindset shift. And there are things we have control over and there are things we do not have control over. And if we choose to focus on the things we don't have control over, that's not a positive net impact on our bodies.
Mhm.
And there's also that sleep piece, for a lot of people that are stressed, they're not sleeping. We know that, stress will impact the immune response in a number of different ways. But I always remind people that if you want to have a fighting chance, literally, at being able to beat an infection, or, for your health, your insulin response, insulin sensitivity, you've got to get good quality sleep. And so for me, it becomes this multi-layered approach to supporting immunity. And then, the other pieces that kind of ties into the weight gain is that when people are stressed, they don't eat too much broccoli. They're not going overboard with tart apples. They eat stuff that is going to further exacerbate this insulin response. So they're having cookies and candy and ice cream. And don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect, but you have to understand that that will, cause you not only to take in a surplus of calories, dysregulate your blood sugar, probably not make you feel all that great, but a degree of inflammation and inflammaging that is also not going to be beneficial for your immune system function. So I think there are multiple things that feed into, literally, feed into, how robust an immune response we may or may not have. And, you mentioned the mindset piece, and I did touch on that, but I think that's probably the most important thing, because if our body perceives that we're stressed or perceives that we're in danger, it's going to, turn off certain parts of our brain, like, the prefrontal cortex, and we're going to act more like the lizard brain. And the lizard brain is designed for survival. It's not designed to think and rationalize and, to be thoughtful and methodical in the way that we interact with our environment. So lots of different reasons to try to mitigate managing stress and recognizing how tied in it is to our immune system response, for sure.
Yeah, that's kind of what I feel like my purpose is, because I had chronic stress breakdown and burnout in 2013 and changed my life since that. But it's just, I feel like that's the biggest thing to address this year is if you want to be healthy, if you want to improve your immune system and resiliency, let's work on identifying your sources of external chronic stress and identify your hidden internal chronic sources of stress inside. Because I think, especially talking to endurance athletes, what did they do? Type A, overachiever, driven people, what are they going to do when they're locked down? Overtrain. So it's like, are you adding more stress to your body when we're having this constant, world stress? And I stopped watching the news on, I don't really watch TV at all since June or before that. And, really working on taking this time to nourish your soul and just eating healthy foods and doing all the stuff we're talking about. But how does intermittent fasting help us? Or is it something we shouldn't be doing? Because I know some people doing alternate day fasting, doing these 36-hour fasts and then feast. And, when is it good for us to fast and why?
Well, that's a great question. I can tell you that in the midst of the height of the pandemic, I would have given a different answer. But I think intermittent fasting or eating less often in a 24-hour period is something all of us can embrace, with very few exceptions. And so we know that when we're eating less often, that helps, stabilize that insulin response, improves cognition. We know that with longer fasts, we know that there's a significant impact on stem cell production. And we know that when we are tapping into ketones for energy, it actually boosts this hormone called BDNF by up to 400% in our brains. So you can actually impact brain stem cells. And I don't know about you, but I think one of my favorite benefits of intermittent fasting is just the improved cognition. Now, I know in the midst of the height of the pandemic, there were, physicians and researchers coming out and suggesting that we shouldn't do long, prolonged fasts. I think that's really highly bio-individual. I myself don't do a lot of prolonged fasting anymore, just because I'm like a lean hyper responder. And if you're not as familiar with what that is, my body, the net benefit of me doing really long fasts and being as lean as I am is pretty minuscule. Dr. Ted Naiman talks about this quite a bit. But I do know that, under normal circumstances, those 3 to 5 day long fasts, that's when you really see this stem cell production, telomere length is positively impacted. We know autophagy really ramps up after 18 to 24 hours. And that's this waste and recycling process. It's kind of like taking out the garbage. We get rid of diseased and disordered cells, which is one of the really key benefits to intermittent fasting. So I think to answer your question, I would say on so many levels, fasting should be incorporated in most, if not all, of our lives. Obviously, being mindful of where we are in time and space. So obviously, if you're still getting your periods, you have to have a slightly different way of managing intermittent fasting than someone who's menopausal. There are obviously contraindications to intermittent fasting, but for the average person, man or woman, intermittent fasting is definitely something that can help boost immunity, as well as, biophysical markers. I always talk a lot about, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, your blood pressure, your overall cholesterol pattern. And those kinds of things are always things that we can be working on, even when we're, not able to be as mobile as we would like to be. And I find that, one of the things that I like best about intermittent fasting is that you have control over it. There's a lot we don't have control over right now, but with intermittent fasting, you can decide what window of eating works for you. You can decide when that window starts and ends. You can decide what you choose to eat during that feeding window. It's never an excuse to just eat junk. You want to make sure you're giving your body the best high quality food that your budget permits. And I'm a huge advocate of people, really focusing on protein and healthy fats, and then earning your carbohydrates, and the carbs, in my world don't really come from gluten and grain. So really getting whole food sources of carbohydrates, if you are choosing to make them or incorporate them into your feeding schedule.
Hmm. So I often talk about is what we eat, but also the how,
Mm-hmm.
why, where, and
Mm-hmm.
when. And I think it's so much to being healthy and figuring out what to eat. But I think a lot of people, you get keto or carnivore,
Mm-hmm.
paleo, primal, ancestral, or this standard American diet, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also that eating window.
Mm-hmm.
But how we're eating, I know a lot of people just eat really fast and they're
Yeah.
rushing and they're just like, okay, I gotta get this food down and move on the next thing. And in nutritional therapy, we learned first thing,
Right.
eat real food, and then digestion, being that
Mm-hmm.
parasympathetic state, pause, reset, reboot, and shift into that correct digestion nervous system. But I think so many people are rushing and
Mm-hmm.
racing through life and forget about that part. So you're eating real food, but we never really work on how we're eating. And it's so
Right.
funny. It's like, okay, don't you need to chew 20, 30 times? Don't you need to sit and focus and be mindful versus
Mm-hmm.
mindlessly eating? I think that's another part that not everyone always addresses for people.
Absolutely. And I think that you bring up a really good point that, the only way we can really prime our bodies for digestion or acceptance of food is we have to be in the parasympathetic, the rest and repose side of our brains. And so I remind people, even taking a couple deep breaths before you sit down, looking out in nature, like one of my favorite things, we're obviously in a rental because we're building right now, but I can sit at the kitchen island and I can look outside. And right now, I mean, the trees are falling in the part of the United States we live in, but I can just see nature. And that has become a very protective time during my day. My family knows this. It's like, it's my 15 or 20 minutes where
Mhm.
I'm just decompressing. I'm not checking email. I'm not responding to social media. I'm really just enjoying the process of eating, which
Mhm.
is very different than when I worked as an NP and I was standing up and dictating and eating and getting interrupted. And, if I was lucky, I was eating. Sometimes I was eating, God forbid, a protein bar because it was either that or nothing during my shift work. So yeah, I think that's a really important point to emphasize to your listeners, that you have to be relaxed when you're eating. Same thing when you're having a bowel movement. I have all these
Mhm.
people that are hyper stressed and I'm like, you have to set aside time in the morning when no one's banging on the door, when you can have, time to allow your body to be in the right frame of mind to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's really important part is why we eat. And I think a lot of athletes and people working at home, they've got their kids at home,
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to get their exercise in, and those type A to triple A personalities are just trying to fit everything in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just kind of chaotic world in people's homes right now. So chronic stress and eating and fasting, is it
Mm-hmm.
good to do 16 hours or, start with 12 if people aren't fasting now, and how they can make the best out of it to create beneficial experience and response.
Yeah. So if you're someone that finishes dinner at 6 p.m. and you eat breakfast at 8, you're already doing 14 hours. So I find that a lot of people are fasting without realizing it. So I always say low and slow. And the more processed your diet is, so if you're coming from a standard American diet, it's going to take you longer to become fat adapted, where your body is, tapping into the freezer storage for energy, as opposed to just, burning glucose as the primary fuel source. So to answer your question, yes, you could start with 12 or 13 hours fasted and slowly open up that window. But I think it's also important to have the conversation that if you're eating a highly processed carb centric diet, it's going to take you a hell of a lot longer to become fat adapted. So along with the, recommendations, pull the training wheels off, stop snacking, start restructuring your meals, start having less, quantity of carbohydrates. And if you're a woman over the age of 40, carbs suddenly become much more problematic, meaning you can't just eat copious amounts of rice or pasta or bread. Those days are gone. It's best to just rip the Band-Aid off and just say it. So I encourage people they don't necessarily have to be low carb, because that may look a little different for everyone. If the average American's consuming 200 to 300 grams of carbs a day, and that's average, so a lot of people are consuming way more, going 100 grams of carb or less can kind of tip them over into feeling really miserable. So,
Mhm.
being really deliberate with, scaling back on the volume of carbohydrates you're eating. And our bodies can make carbohydrates all on its own. It's a process called gluconeogenesis. I like to remind people the only two macronutrients that we have to have in our diet are protein and fat. But our body can make carbohydrates. For every 100 gram of protein that we consume, we can make 60 grams of carbohydrates. And I like to remind people of that, all that triggers a lot of people, to really be mindful of the way that we're fueling our bodies. Because once you get to a point, and for some people it could be 2 weeks, others it could be 6 or 8, when you're fully fat adapted, then you can do those longer fasts. Then you can probably get to a point where you're doing 18 or 20-hour fasts. But once you're fat adapted, that's when I encourage people to get creative with their feeding and fasting windows. But when you're starting out, much to your point, 12, 13, 14-hour fasts are great. And then you slowly want to keep opening it up until you're, aiming for 16 hours is a good place to aim for. But for some people that may take a little bit of time, and that's okay. We're all bio individuals. And, obviously everyone has a different threshold. Some people are much more sensitive, especially if they're prone to insulin resistance or they're hypoglycemic, it may take them a little bit longer to get to that point. And, like I said, slow and steady, you're not in a race with anyone else, just really doing what's best for your body. And I find people start feeling so much better so quickly. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm so clear cognitively because their insulin levels are lower. And we know that's part of that metabolic flexibility. The more metabolically flexible we are, then more insulin sensitive we are, the more we are able to, kind of manage our weight and, not to be treated for multiple high blood pressure and high cholesterol and all these other things that are becoming very much the norm, which I think is a huge concern.
Yeah, I always say those, and don't blame the aging response and don't accept that
Yes.
as your new normal. That's just how I am, and that's what I have
Yes.
to live with because that's my body. It just always drives me nuts. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
improve the aging process and make the best of it, and a lot of that simple ways as doing the intermittent fasting. That's why I
Mm-hmm.
love it. And once you are fat adapted, it's becoming I can't think of the word, but just not intentional.
Mm-hmm.
It just happens that, it's 10:30 as I'm recording this and I went for a run or and yoga this morning and
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not hungry, but I can,
Mm-hmm.
have my tea and coffee and water and I'm not intentionally fasting. It just
Right.
works out that way.
Right.
It gets to be your normal is like I wait till I'm hungry to eat. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of times people are trained breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack in between because we're raised that way. And I think
Yeah.
it's breaking that relationship with food. Is that what you find with a lot of people when they start? Are they eating a lot of
Um,
processed foods and carbs and eating by time of day?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of dogma that has to be disproven. I was trained in the 90s as a nurse and a nurse practitioner. And so a lot of things that I was taught are actually blatantly wrong. And so you can appreciate and understand why there's so much confusion.
Yeah.
People genuinely want to do what's right. But especially as people get over like 35, all of a sudden, eating all day long is not a good thing. I think the average American eats 16 to 17 times a day between sugar sweetened beverages and then food. And so you start to understand if each time they eat or drink, they're spiking insulin, why they're struggling to lose weight. So, I think it really depends on what methodology people are coming from. I think people think they're going to starve if they don't eat breakfast. I think they're then surprised when they stop eating breakfast, how good they feel. I think the trick is really, explaining to people what clean fasting is, what's that concept, because there's a lot of dirty fasting that goes on, sugary teas, whether it's like apple or berry or whatever, it's like bitter teas. They don't evoke an insulin response. Plain coffee does not evoke an insulin response. Obviously,
Mhm.
water does not evoke an insulin response. But when people are trying to lose weight and they're consuming fatty coffees, I know Dave Asprey, who's a very nice man, I've met him, would love to convince everyone that we need bulletproof coffee. No, we don't. We do not need fatty coffees. And if you're trying to lose weight, why would you consume something that's 200 or 300 calories during your fast? That makes zero sense. Really being deliberate about the way that you look at fasting to do it right. Like I'm very much not really putting the training wheels on. I just remind people that maybe you go from eating 3 meals a day and snacks to not eating snacks. Maybe you then do that for 2 weeks and you get your blood sugar better stabilized and then you remove breakfast. It doesn't have to be like ripping off the Band-Aid all at once so that people are miserable, because that's obviously really hard to adopt a new strategy or a new lifestyle change and really be miserable. but being intentional about what's your why. That's
Mm-hmm.
the most important thing, because without a why, what are you
Mm-hmm.
doing? You
Yeah.
know, I love telling people that when I first heard about fasting, which was about 6 years ago, and read Jason Fung's book, The Complete Guide to Fasting, which I think is the best book
Yes.
that's written for the lay public on
Mm-hmm.
fasting, very easy, accessible. I think that when I read that, I initially, in my typical skeptical kind of mindset, I was like, this can't be that easy. And then I
Yeah.
started doing it. I was like, I feel great. Then I got my husband doing it. Then I got a lot of my patients doing it. Then I got friends doing it. Then I got family members doing it. And so I look at it as, really creating a wave of people that are ready to take back their health. It's like, I don't want to buy into whatever, negative mindset there is. I'm obviously middle-aged. I'm in my 40s. When I hear women talking about themselves, because that's the preponderance of patient profile that I work with, there's so much negativity about aging. It's like, oh, well, I just have to accept this. No, you don't. There's so many ways to kind of take back your health. And a lot of people that I, speak with under normal circumstances, that are on the speaker circuits, that are in the health and wellness space, they all look way younger than they are. And they
Yeah.
look way younger because they take care of their health. They eat
Mm-hmm.
a nutrient dense diet, they sleep, they prioritize the mindset and, connection to the earth. And they get outside and they exercise and they're happy. And so, why not do something that kind of goes against conventional dogma? Because if we continue doing what we've been conditioned to believe, which is eat, a carbohydrate dense breakfast, which we know was created by the processed food industry and the cereal industry, we know what that does. It spikes your insulin. Your body can't access that energy, which is why you get hungry. It just stores it. So it's like it just keeps getting stored. And then when you kind of transition to being fat adapted, or, being in ketosis, all of a sudden you can access the freezer. You can access that stored energy and use that for fuel. And it's very freeing. Like I have teenage boys now, but when they were younger, I mean, their metabolisms were like hummingbirds. Well, they still are. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse because now they eat 3 times as much. But I remember we used to pack like healthy snacks to take with us because someone was always hungry in between meals. But we as adults don't need that, and I would argue that most children don't either. But the point of why I'm sharing this is that I encourage anyone, don't be a sheep. Don't, necessarily ascribe to conventional dogma about nutrition or lifestyle, because most of what we've been taught as clinicians that we've been telling our patients is wrong. I was never taught much about nutrition other than what was included in the food guide pyramid as a nurse and a nurse practitioner. And I went to a top-notch research university. And I tell people all the time, I didn't learn about nutrition until I did this nutritional therapy program, which completely changed the trajectory of my career. But I think it's really, really important for that message to get out there, that you don't have to be a slave to the processed food industry. You don't have to be a slave to the mindset that you have to eat 3 meals a day and snacks, and that it's totally okay to eat a carbohydrate dense diet, because that's just couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yeah. So there's so many things you said. I just want to touch on. I was like, my hot spots. But it is always the why is always my
Mhm.
big thing, and it is what I've talked about since, I don't know, 2005. I started doing metabolic testing on people with New Leaf. Sadly, the company got sold, I don't know, 5 years ago, so I couldn't do it anymore. But I wish I could, still test people on a treadmill and bike, but also
Mhm.
resting there. And we didn't know metabolic flexibility back
Mhm.
then. It was just testing people. Where do you burn fat? What's your
Yeah.
metabolism at rest? And I so wish I could just be able to do that on people all the time, because now it's like, all right, we can have a continuous glucose monitor on them, and then let's see what we can tweak and alter, because it's N equals 1 on your nutrition and your stress and
Mhm.
exercise, to figure out how you can burn fat and
Mhm.
really optimize your health and your performance. So it's just all this information we can get nowadays to learn how to improve our performance longevity,
Mhm.
rather than just going by the old stuff or the news you still hear on the media of, that it's political nutrition we are told about. But it's a choice. So it's just working on how you can really take control, ownership of your own health and well-being.
Have you tried the Lumen yet?
No, not yet. Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah, I've been experimenting with it largely because I wanted to see if it was something I would recommend to my clients and my patients. And it's really fascinating. For any of the listeners that aren't familiar with what Lumen is, it's a device you blow into. So it's measuring CO2. And what's interesting is the lowest number you can get is a 1 or a 2, which demonstrates you're fat adapted. And then the highest numbers when you're using primarily carbs as a fuel source are like 4 and 5. And so the first week I had it, every time I blew into this device, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. Well, on Saturday night, I had my first martini I probably have had the entire year, and I had some gluten-free cookies because I was at a dinner at our friend's house, and I felt terrible. And so the next day, I wasn't at all surprised that I was blowing 5s. And I blew 5s all day. And then I blew 4s the following day. And today is Tuesday. So this is 3 days later. I'm still blowing 4s and 5s.
Wow.
And this is from someone who's very lean, very fat adapted. And it just shows you like the degree of metabolic flexibility. I'm like, so if the average person did that, I don't know how long it would take them to get back. But for me, I was shocked and humbled. Like, I was like, wow. I mean, I think it's going to take a couple days. And that's just after one drink and a couple cookies. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. This is my N of 1. So I will let you know what it shows. But I think it's a fairly easy biotech device that people can look into.
Yeah, I did NutriSense for 2 weeks, and I would do it longer if I could. It was just so fascinating. And, talking to athletes, and then the female athlete and menstrual cycle and how that changes too. So it is, the fluctuations, but how fasting can come into play with, you know, with athletes and burning fat. And when is it, good to do a fasted workout? And I think a lot of athletes think, oh, I worked out, I can eat whatever I want.
No.
And think, oh, I can carbo load and eat all this. But then you listen to like Gabrielle Leon, Dr. Leon is just all about the protein part. So what's your take on athletes for nutrition and fasting and performance longevity?
Good question. Well, if they're still getting their menstrual cycle, they need to adjust their fasting schedule the week preceding their periods. We know that there is a heightened sense of insulin sensitivity. So I generally recommend a shorter fasting window. So you're not doing 16, 18, 20-hour fasts, and more carbohydrates. And so this is oftentimes when a woman is craving more carbs anyway. I mean, it's like you kind of listen intuitively what your body is saying. That was always the time that I would crave potatoes or squash, or maybe I craved dark chocolate because I probably needed more magnesium. And so the thought process is that, so when your progesterone is kind of predominating that second half of the menstrual cycle, that's when you would have an increased carbohydrate intake. And then once your menstrual cycle starts, you go back to your normal fasting and carbohydrate intake. Now, again, because I mentioned that there's this process of gluconeogenesis. So I do believe that athletes can train on a higher protein, moderate carbohydrate diet. I think so much of it is bio-individual though. I do find that every once in a while I'll get someone that's plant-based. And so I have to kind of restructure my brain, because my feeling is I'm very much an omnivore. I eat a lot of meat. I'm carnivore-ish. I probably eat more meat than anything, but that works for my body at this stage of my life. But I like to remind people that the challenge I have with plant-based diets when people want to be low carb is their protein is so narrow. It's like nuts, seeds, and hemp seeds. And I don't know about you, but that's as much as I might enjoy those things, it's nearly as satiating as like a steak or a piece of bison or, some pork or a piece of fish. So I think it really becomes a little bit challenging, but I encourage people to monitor what's your energy, what's your sleep quality like, what's your menstrual cycle like, if you're still getting one, to help kind of fine tune macros, not only that, but your fasting schedule. And so I'm not seemingly giving a kind of a nebulous response. It just goes to show you that there really is, ways that we try to fine tune things based on where someone is in their cycle, being attuned to what their sleep quality is, being attuned to what their energy levels are like, because for every 10 people that work well with intermittent fasting and in moderate or low carb, there are other people that will start and they can't sleep and their energy's in the toilet, and then they stop getting their periods. And I have to remind people that intermittent fasting works for many, but might not work for everyone. And sometimes it's just situational, but there are definitely times where I will tell women, you need more of this macro, less of this. I think you have to kind of use those, I call them vital signs. You have to kind of really think about how those things impact your body and then adjust accordingly.
Are you a what do you call it? Head to tail, nose to tail carnivore? Do you know the organ?
I try. I grew up, my mom's Italian, so I grew up eating organ meat. I have to do a lot to organ meat to make it palatable. I'll be completely transparent. I was laughing because I interviewed Paul Saladino,
Mm-hmm.
who's carnivore code, fascinating discussion that we had. And I had to laugh because I asked him what he was eating for lunch that day, because that was a question that came up from listeners. And it was like, like cow pancreas and spleen of elk or something. And I was like, and he showed me a picture and I was like, wow, I'm not sure I could do that, but good for you.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like, I'll stick with my liver and I'll be good with that. Now, what I've found is I have to get creative with those things. And so it might be that I mix in some liver into ground meat, and then it's not as, it's just for me, I'm a hyper taster. So really bitter or really extreme flavors don't appeal to me. I
Yeah.
was never that person that like coffee. And I drink bitter tea every day because I like the health benefits, not due to the taste. So to kind of like be fully transparent, um, I find that a lot of organ meats are very kind of off-putting because they're very strong. It's a very strong taste meat. But I'm always open-minded. I'm always game for trying things. I find there's a lot that I don't like, but as long as I can cut it and I can chew it, I'm good. If it's like tough, then I really struggle. So that's my true honest answer. I'm not nearly as adventurous as some of my peers, and I'm okay with that.
I am not at all. I just started eating red meat pretty much last year after I don't know, 40 years not eating it. So
Wow.
it's just hanging out with all my carnivore friends at KetoCon, and I was on Jimmy Moore's low carb cruise as a speaker in PaleoFX, and
Cool.
then I was like, all right, my body suddenly is like, I'm ready.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll try it. But just the whole organ meat part. I know my friend Danny Vega is always showing these pictures and other people on Instagram. I'm like, oh, I can't do
Yeah.
it.
And I think it's okay. One of the things I don't like sometimes is this kind of like, as much as I love the health and wellness community family, sometimes there's like this shaming of, oh, well, you're not a
Yeah.
real carnivore if you don't do this. And I'm like,
Yeah.
listen, we're all individuals. We're all doing the best we can. If the option is to eat a fillet versus, kidney of the cow, I know what I'm going to pick. I'm sure it might be the same as you.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. Ancestral supplements, looking at here's, in a capsule, just rip the label off for me. Don't tell me
Hmm.
what I'm taking all these different organ parts.
Yep.
So, anyways, but I was just curious of, what you find that works for yourself and what you like to suggest clients to start with, because I know it's very confusing out there. And in nutritional therapy, we're all
Hmm.
bioindividuality is essential part of figuring out what to eat. There's not one diet for all, but it is real food based. What
Yep.
the macros are adjusted per person. But I think it gets, confusing out there that people are into social media and just following what
Hmm.
someone else does and
Right.
try it out. So it's kind of like, okay, I want to burn fat. What do I do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to do a couple things. I think that, you need to focus your macros on protein and, moderate carbs. I mean, I don't eat ketogenic. I mean, I'm low carb most of the time. I'm just happy there. Like my family laughs because, I cycle my carbs, but when I cycle my carbs, I eat like sweet potatoes and
Mhm.
squash. I mean, or I might eat, God forbid, every once in a while I might eat a just green banana or a plantain, but like, I mean, that's about the extent of it. I'm very happy in my low carb world, but
Yeah.
with that being said, there's a lot of trial and error. I had
Mhm.
a very lengthy hospitalization last year and I came
Oh,
out,
yeah.
I was paleo before I went in, came out and my body couldn't handle any fiber. And so for 6 months, I was full carnivore because otherwise that got my digestive system moving a little too fast. And even to this day, I still don't tolerate some things I used to love eating. Like I can't do Brussels sprouts or
Mm.
broccoli. I just finally started being able to eat cabbage and like cauliflower again. And so that was like a moral victory. Every once in a while, I'll eat a little bit of salad. Like I can handle arugula, but not kale and not spinach. And
Huh.
so it goes back to, just being attuned and listening to your body. What's your
Mhm.
digestion like? What makes you feel
Yeah.
good? What allows you to
Yeah.
sleep well? What gives you lots of energy? And so empowering people to recognize that could look a little different for everyone. But my thing that I will hang my hat on and die from is that women of a certain age can't just eat any old carbohydrate. I get lots of hate mail when I say that, but the more insulin sensitive you are, the
Mhm.
more metabolically flexible you are, the more carbohydrates you tolerate. If you are the opposite, you're trying to lose weight, you're metabolically inflexible, you're insulin resistant, you need to, go pretty low carb or keto, even for short term, a couple months to kind of jumpstart things, maybe have a couple longer fasting windows. And that's one way to kind of help get you back to being a little more insulin sensitive, but it can be a lot of give and take. There's a lot of people that really struggle in their late 30s and early 40s because they've always been able to eat whatever they want, and all of a sudden they can't. They hit perimenopause, they drink too much alcohol. Alcohol is a big one. If
Mm-hmm.
you're, using that to self-medicate because you're either anxious, depressed, or can't sleep, I got news for you. Your body will process that alcohol before any other macro. And so it just shuttles everything else into storage. And so that's why I don't drink very often. And it probably
Mm-hmm.
explains why I felt so crummy this weekend.
Yeah, gonna hit you for a few days. But
Mm-hmm.
so, changing fasting based on women's cycle is something
Mm-hmm.
you talk about. And then, pre-luteal phase versus, you know, the rest of the month and what people
Mm-hmm.
need to do, female athletes should change their
Yeah.
fasting
And
if
so
you
I
want to be
think
longer.
it's probably a little more challenging when you're an athlete. Like if you're a true athlete and your body needs a certain amount of macros to thrive, you may not be able to fast every day. You may only be able to fast. Maybe you're fasting once a week. Maybe you're fasting a
Mhm,
couple times a month.
mhm.
I just find that a lot of female athletes or people that are a little younger, you got to get your macros in. And if you can't get your macros in, it may not be the right strategy, or you just do a shortened fasting window. And I don't think there's any shame in saying, I need a 12-hour feeding window if you're an athlete and you need 3 solid meals to be able to power through workouts and to feel like you're thriving, whether they're trying to gain muscle or they're doing endurance work. I just think it gets a little bit more nuanced with
Mm.
women that are athletes. And I'm not just talking about someone who's fit and goes to the gym. I mean, that's more the camp I'm in. I'm not an athlete, but I do find that, there's a lot of differing opinions on this particular age group and this particular demographic. And so what I've come to find based on my own research and working with different people, it's really highly independent.
Mhm.
You got to get your macros in. That's clear. And if you can't get, Dr. Lyons always talks about it's 1 gram of protein per ideal pound of body weight. And if you weigh 150 pounds and you only get 75 grams of protein in, then you're protein deficient. And so it may be that you are not someone that's going to thrive on, doing a more formal intermittent fasting strategy, but it could be that you've got a 12-hour feeding window and you get 3 solid meals in and you're a healthy weight, you feel good, your menstrual cycle is not irregular, you're sleeping well, you have plenty of energy, you're hitting all your goals for your athletic career. And that's just the way that you need to be. But I think when people are training at that level, that's certainly very unique. And,
Mm.
certainly women are not many men. And almost all of the research on intermittent fasting has been done on lab animals, men and menopausal women. And so we know menopausal women have a little bit of an easier time with intermittent fasting because, the hormones aren't cycling quite as dramatically day to day, week to week as they are when a woman's still getting her menstrual cycle.
Have you talked to Dr. Stacy Sims on her
I
book
have
or never
not
interviewed
yet.
her? Yeah, because that's what she talks about is women
Mm-hmm.
are not small men and about
Mm-hmm.
all the hormones and changing, but she's not necessarily low carb,
Mm-hmm.
but just looking at matching your nutrition and your
Mm-hmm.
exercise to your menstrual cycle. And I think it's a good topic for women to look at to figure
Mm-hmm.
out, are you doing what you should do to improve your performance and
Right.
longevity, and to keep burning fat. But anyways, I think hormones are really important for women. I think sometimes I wonder if fasting for athletes, for female athlete, if say I get up and I go for a 2-hour
Mm-hmm.
bike ride, then I don't eat till a few hours later. You always wonder, okay, is that too much stress? Because you're not really hungry because you're good at
Right.
efficient at burning fat. But then how do you know when you might be fasting too long and your body's causing your body more stress because
Right.
you're starving it of not eating? And when can you tell that it needs actual fuel?
Right. Right. Well, and I think it's important to say as a distinction that fasting is not starving because
Yes.
it's eating within a prescribed time period or eating less often. But I think, the comments I made about your menstrual cycle, your energy and your sleep are ways that you can guide, is this working for me?
Yeah.
Because if you're overtraining and under eating, you're probably not going to sleep well. You're probably not
Mm-hmm.
going to have consistent energy and your cycles are very likely to be wonky. And it could be, I always say when people first kind of acclimate to intermittent fasting, they might miss a cycle or two. But if you miss more than that, or if your cycle completely goes away, that's a sign that your body perceives it's too much stress. Like that intermittent fasting is a hormetic stressor, but too much of any type of stress is not beneficial to the body. So I think that's usually how I, gauge whether or not it's a good strategy. And let me be very clear. I don't work with athletes. I work with a lot of fit people, but I don't work with athletes because that's not my zone of genius. I refer them out to the experts in our, vast network of health and wellness professionals to, get their input.
Yes, no, you're amazing at, the research and on fasting and just kind of go-to person on intermittent fasting and being healthy, and for females to improve the aging process and, working with hormones. And I think it's the struggle for everyone to feel their best, look their best, and move their best. And, whatever level of exercise you're doing shouldn't matter, but what are you doing right now that's improving your ability to be healthy and look at how you want to live your life in 10 years, 20 years is what I keep saying to people. It's like, okay, let's do what we're doing now to feel great, but how do you want to look in 5 years or 10 years? Do you want to be, I would say when I'm 70, 80 years old, I want to be traveling around the world and enjoying retirement, not be like, sitting in a wheelchair or using a cane to get up a hill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for women in particular, we have to maintain muscle, we have to maintain flexibility, we have to continue to move our bodies. And so the chronic cardio queens, as I refer to them affectionately, I'm like, I lift weights. That is very deliberate. I lift weights, I do solid core, I do lots of yoga. I just find that and like just moving, like, this is a good example today. There's a lot of sitting because I'm taping and client work. And I'm like, when I have my last, appointment this afternoon, I'm taking the dogs for a long walk because I'll get sunshine. And I agree with you that it really depends on, what your goals are. But, as we kind of pass that threshold, like 35, 40, women are heading into perimenopause, it's like, what do you want to do? You want to maintain bone health. You want to maintain your muscles, because the more muscles you have, the more calorie burning you can provide your body, more metabolically flexible you are, the more insulin sensitive you are. So it always goes back to just being deliberate. I might not have been deliberate 10 years ago, but I definitely am now.
Yeah. And I've been doing this 30-day to your future self program, Dr. Benjamin Hardy. It's kind of interesting 10-minute video every day he sends, and it's great information to stop and think about, what am I doing now to improve my future self and how I want to be. So anyways, I could talk to you for hours, but I know you have a busy day and let you go enjoy a little 5-minute break before your next appointment. But I think everyone would love to learn more. Where should we send them? I'll put everything in the show notes, but any places to send people now, social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So best place to start is my website. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. There's access to my podcast, Everyday Wellness, my TED Talks, our blog, also links to social media. I'm very active on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube is just starting to grow. For whatever reason, the past year, it's been so busy, but we're finally making a very deliberate effort to grow YouTube. So definitely check me out, subscribe, send me a message if you listen to the podcast. I'd love to connect with you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Love talking to you and so much to dive into, but so I'll have to see you next year. Hopefully in live conferences we'll have going again someday.
That would be awesome. I'm crossing my fingers. I'm trying to manifest a trip. I'm like telling my kids, we're going to take a trip in 2021.
Yeah, you can come out to San Diego.
Would love that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.